FAIRtax is coming, don't stand in the way. FAIRtax is coming across the USA. FAIRtax is coming, clean up this mess. We got to get rid of the IRS. Hey, hey! Hey, hey!
Hello and welcome once again to FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Ron Malero.
And we are the FAIRtax Guys, and we have got something special for you on today's edition of FAIRtax Power Radio. Ron, set up the backstory here real quick.
Well, somewhat over 20 years, actually before the FAIRtax even began, Steve Hayes and Charles Adams wrote this short story, Would Thomas Jefferson Think We Are Free? And I'm not going to give away the details because the skit that we've written is very good, that Bob has written. But what if Thomas Jefferson were to revisit America today? What would he think? And I'm going to leave it at that. Now, you'll recognize Steve Hayes. He is the president of the Americans for Fair Taxation. Charles Adams is an author that Steve worked with. He's the author of For Good and Evil, The Impact of Taxes on the Course of Civilization. So these folks, have been involved in the idea of a consumption tax to replace the income tax for a long time now. And they wrote this story to try to promote that idea. I showed it to Bob a few weeks ago. He ran with it. He said, I'm going to write a radio play based on that story. And he did. And we were able to get some very notable radio personalities because I'm not a good actor, and we have some other people that are. And voila, we have this skit for you, which I think you're going to really enjoy.
Amen. Let's give a little credit where it's due. Chip Morris is going to play the part of Thomas Jefferson. He used to do a talk show here in Ocala and is working with the local civic theater as well. And the other guy in the play, a guy named George Morgan, is played by an old radio friend of mine, Mel Turner. So let's just go ahead and get right into it. Would Thomas Jefferson think we are free today? Our story begins on the evening of April 13th, 2015. Meet George Morgan, a typical American husband and father. George works hard to provide for his family. His job as a commercial pilot with a large airline affords him a comfortable, though hardly a lavish lifestyle. He's just finishing dinner when there's a knock at the door.
Who could that be? We're not expecting company tonight.
George strides quickly across the room and opens the door. Standing there is a tall, slender man with longish red hair, wearing what looks like some kind of costume. The stranger has on a long blue coat over a white vest and white pants, black shoes, and a large brass belt buckle. He reminded George of the characters in the John Adams special he'd just seen on HBO. For a moment, George considers slamming the door and calling the police, but something about the man's relaxed, confident manner stops him.
May I help you?
Hello, I'm Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson? Really? Is this some kind of joke?
No, sir, it's no joke. I'm really Thomas Jefferson. May I come in, sir?
Hesitating briefly, George's mind runs back to a picture he remembers from his 10th grade history book.
He does somewhat resemble Thomas Jefferson. This must be a joke, an impersonator. Somebody hired to mess with me. But, let's see, that was Charlie Gunn. He knows I'm a history buff. Okay, I'll play along. This might be good for a laugh or two. Thomas Jefferson, huh?
Yes, sir.
Well, come on in. My name is George Morgan.
It's nice to meet you, George.
One question. Just how did you get here? This is the year 2015, you know.
Well, it's a long story, but basically I was granted the opportunity to come back and check on our blessed republic. We knew that we were embarking on a marvelous experiment with our fledgling nation. No other nation in the history of the world was ever founded on the principles that we all so passionately believed in. We hoped we were building something solid, something that would survive for centuries to come. I'll always remember what Dr. Franklin said right after the Constitutional Convention. Someone asked him, what form of government was being proposed. His answer was, a republic, if you can keep it. Many warned us throughout history, as governments become more powerful, the people will gradually give up their freedom. The great Frenchman Alex de Tocqueville may have said it best. Society will develop a new kind of servitude which covers the surface of society with a network of complicated rules through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people until each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd. We were so determined to prove him wrong. We were determined to build a nation that valued liberty and individual freedom above all else, a place where government served the people, not the other way around. It's been a dream of mine for more than 2 centuries to come back and see how well it's all held up over time.
Hey, you're pretty good. You've almost got me convinced that you were actually there back then.
Sir, I was there. This is not a joke. I am Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, okay, if you say so. Well, we're still here, but I think you're going to find that de Tocqueville was a lot closer to being right than you might want to believe. It's a very different country today than it was in the beginning.
Indeed. Things do look a lot different. It's rather amazing that I haven't seen one single horse here. How do you people get around?
We have cars now, motorized vehicles that run on gasoline, much faster and more reliable than horses. Most families have at least 2. But if you really want to see something amazing, I'll take you out to the airport and show you a jet airplane.
A jet airplane?
Yes, it's a flying machine.
A flying machine? You mean people can actually fly now?
Oh, yeah. Airplanes have actually been around for over 100 years now. But today's modern jets, like the ones I fly, can carry several hundred people and fly at about 600 miles an hour. You can get from Boston to Paris, France, in about 7 hours today.
7 hours? In 1784, that trip took me an entire month.
Well, you'll find that we've made a lot of progress in 200 years.
George and Thomas continue their conversation about all the technological progress that's been made over the past 2 centuries. Thomas is amazed to learn about telephones, television, refrigerators, microwave ovens, computers, electric lighting, and air conditioning. But soon, his attention is drawn to a pile of papers on George's dining room table. There were all kinds of strange and complicated-looking forms there with funny names like 1040, W-2, 1099, Schedule D, and a host of others.
What is all of this, if I may ask, sir?
Oh, that's my income tax. It's due in 2 days, and it's a real pain in the... well, you know.
Income tax? Who collects an income tax? A few states wanted us to have a federal income tax, but we all knew that that was a horrible idea. All of us knew that an income tax was the tax of tyrants. It would allow the government to intrude on the basic rights of free men. That's why a direct tax was expressly forbidden in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution.
Well, today most states and the federal government all collect an income tax. The federal tax code today is over 77,000 pages long. It's an incredibly complicated process. No one can possibly understand it all. Certainly not the average taxpayer, that's for sure. But it's something every American has to deal with. The way it works is that I have to fill out all these forms telling the government how much money I earned last year and where it all came from. There's a lot of other stuff they need to know too, but when I get it all figured out, I know how much tax I owe. The way they have this set up, the more money I make, the higher my tax rate.
Thomas stares at George in disbelief.
Where did all this come from? That's certainly not what we had in mind for our republic.
Well, of course, they tried to make it easier. My employer has to estimate my tax liability for the year, deduct money from my paycheck every month, and then send that into the government. That's called withholding. If the money withheld from my paycheck meets my tax liability, I don't have to pay anything more. But if it's short, I have to pay the difference by April 15th. If they actually withhold too much, I get a refund, but I still have to fill out all this paperwork to see where I stand with the government. Now, a lot of this paperwork is me trying to reduce my taxable income by taking deductions. I tell them how much I give to my church and other charities, how much interest I pay on my home mortgage, how much I paid for child care and medical expenses, things like that. I also get an exemption for every child, so I tell them how many children I have. Of course, I have to keep pretty detailed records to support the deductions I take, but it does help reduce my taxes. So it's worth the effort, I guess. But you know, a lot of people find all this just too much to deal with, and they pay someone else to do it for them. If you know what you're doing, there's a pretty good living to be made helping other people with their taxes, but I really try to do my own. The real crazy part is that the government already knows how much money I make. My employer, my stockbroker, my bank, anyone I earn money from has to report how much they paid me to the IRS, and then I have to turn around and do it all again on this tax return. I guess they just don't trust me to honestly report my income. It's really an insane system.
It is an insane system. Are you serious? You not only have to report to the government how much money you make, but you have to tell them how much you gave to your church, how much you spend for medical care, and how many children you have? That is none of their business. Now, what is this IRS of which you speak, sir?
The Internal Revenue Service. It's this huge federal agency that costs about $10 billion a year to operate. They administer the income tax, and you sure don't want to get on their bad side. They have the right to audit your tax return, and they can go back several years. They can come into your home and demand that you produce documentation for every number you report on your tax return. That's why you need all those receipts and records I was telling you about. They can inspect all your financial records and make you account for every transaction. They can seize those records if they want to, and can even take your computer if you keep your records electronically. Then, if they're not satisfied with your explanations, they can arbitrarily declare that you owe more tax. At that point, they can seize your bank account, garnish your wages, even take your house, all without you even being charged with any kind of wrongdoing, much less being convicted of anything. They can even make you testify against yourself under oath.
Mr. Jefferson is visibly stunned. The idea of having to divulge sensitive personal financial information to the government is bad enough, but a federal agency with that kind of power was simply unimaginable.
But wait a minute. You have rights. The Constitution protects you from that kind of tyrannical government. You're guaranteed due process. You're protected from unreasonable search and seizure. You're presumed innocent until proven guilty. It's all right there in the Bill of Rights.
Welcome to the 21st century, my friend. None of that stuff applies when it comes to the IRS. They pretty much do what they want to, and they get away with it.
Mr. Jefferson feels like he's been hit with a sledgehammer. For a few moments, he's rendered utterly speechless. Sadly shaking his head, he begins to realize that the past 200 years have not been so kind to the republic that he and his fellow founding fathers so dearly loved.
Let me try to understand this, sir. People in this country today have to tell the government all about their personal finances. The government helps itself to part of everyone's paycheck before they get it, and that it has the power to swoop in and demand even more without any due process or presumption of innocence. Is that right?
Yep, that's about it in a nutshell.
At this point, Mr. Jefferson collapses into a chair with an ashen look on his face. Cradling his head in his hands, he stares down at the floor. A small tear begins to trickle down his cheek. George just stands there looking at him, suddenly feeling guilty but not knowing what to do.
I can't believe this. This is worse than anything the British ever tried to do to the colonies. We fought a long and bloody revolution against a government far less intrusive and tyrannical than this. Thousands of freedom-loving patriots died so that men might be free from oppressive government. Tell me, George, how did this happen? Surely there must have been some grave financial emergency that required the imposition of such a despotic tax system. Free Americans would never accept something like this unless there was some incredibly dire circumstance.
There was no emergency. There were people in the country who thought it was simply not fair that some people made so much more money than others. The tax was to be used to provide some benefits for poor Americans.
But they can't do that. An income tax is strictly forbidden. Don't your leaders understand history? All of us who worked on the Constitution knew history. We knew that great civilizations began to decline when they introduced direct taxation. We specifically disallowed direct taxation because we knew it would yield the same results that other nations had already experienced. We knew that direct taxation invariably leads to the erosion of individual rights and the oppression of the minority by the majority. Most importantly, direct taxation allows the government to steal at will from its citizens. We knew all that. We knew all that. So we wrote provisions into the Constitution to be sure that that would never happen here. Have today's Americans forgotten history?
I guess we have. As I said, in the early 1900s, there were people pushing for an income tax as a way for the government to provide some benefits to poorer Americans. They promised that it would be just a small tax on a very small number of people. Only the richest of the rich would have to pay it, and they could easily afford it. The people saw no reason to oppose a tax that didn't affect them. In fact, most were actually quite happy to see the government take money from the rich. Economic justice, they called it. So they amended your Constitution. The 16th Amendment was ratified in 1913, and that amendment gave the federal government the right to collect an income tax. I guess no one imagined how big, how cumbersome, and how intrusive it would become.
Those fools! How could they have been so blind to history? How could they not see what an income tax would become and what it would do to the people?
Yeah, they sure made a mess. Not only has the income tax grown into a horrible monstrosity that no one understands, the country is now $18 trillion in debt. And it's getting worse by the day, and there's no end in sight.
$18 trillion in debt? How did that happen? I remember exactly what I said back in 1789. I told everyone who would listen that I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution. I would be willing to depend on that alone for the reduction of the administration of our government to the general principles of the Constitution. I mean, an additional article taking from the federal government the power of borrowing. Everyone laughed at me. They said that debts would only be incurred in a time of war or emergency because everyone knew a national debt would be destructive. In my second inaugural address, I warned everyone that we must meet all of the expenses each year without encroaching on the rights of future generations. We must not burden our posterity with debts of the past. We've seen the devastating effects of carrying a national debt. What are you people thinking?
Again, George hangs his head in shame. He's keenly aware of Jefferson's probing eyes looking up at him, pleading for some kind of sane answer, and George simply doesn't have one. By now, he could no longer stand to even look his visitor in the eye. Staring straight down and shifting about nervously, George offers a meager excuse.
I guess everyone got so busy with their own lives, they just quit paying attention to what the government was doing. Of course, this didn't happen all at once. It was phased in little by little over time. There were a few people who did notice what was happening and tried to sound a warning, but they were largely dismissed as kooks and alarmists. Looks like they were right. If only we had just paid more attention.
And this is what we risked our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor for. We thought we were giving future generations a free country, governed by the people and for the people. What you have done is taken our idea and twisted it beyond recognition. You have freely submitted to a despotism much worse than anything we ever faced. You may think you're free, but that's because you choose not to see the chains and the walls that imprison you. And my friend, you do live in a prison. You have allowed the government into the most private places of your personal lives. In essence, you work for the government, not for yourselves. Your ancestors would not know you. I'm sorry for my country, and I'm sorry for you. Good night.
With that, Mr. Jefferson slowly gets up, ambles across the room, and walks dejectedly out the front door. As George watches the tall figure disappear into the mist, he feels a despairing sadness like none other he has ever felt before. He knows that Jefferson was right. He knows that what happened is exactly what Thomas Paine predicted, that Americans would not lose their freedoms all at once. Instead, those precious liberties would be slowly eroded away bit by bit, and that no one would really notice what was happening to them until it was too late. So now the question becomes, is it really too late? Has the erosion of our individual liberties really gone past the point of no return? Is the Internal Revenue Service so firmly entrenched in every nook and cranny of our lives that it's impossible to rid ourselves of its malevolent grasp? My fellow patriots, the choice is yours. Wow, how true that is. What Thomas Jefferson might think if he were able to come back to modern-day America. I don't think he'd be too pleased with some of the things he'd see, especially that little thing called the 16th Amendment.
Yeah, we have the benefit of the last 100 years to realize that the 16th Amendment was a huge mistake, and we've got to change that. We really need to get back to the simpler times of the Founding Fathers, all right? I've got a couple of quotes here from Thomas Jefferson. I was digging these up on the internet.
I thought you just talked to him yesterday. Sorry about that.
Well, it seemed like it the way Chip and Mel were going on. It sounded like they were right here. But this quote, "Enlighten the people generally, and tyranny and oppressions of the body and mind will vanish like the spirits at the dawn of the day." That was Thomas Jefferson in 1816. This one is especially good. It's a little bit longer. "Cherish, therefore, the spirit of our people, and keep alive their attention. Do not be too severe upon their errors, but reclaim them by enlightening them. If once they become inattentive to the public affairs, you and I and Congress and assemblies, judges, governors shall become the wolves." Now, what do we mean by that? If the public becomes inattentive, if they don't pay attention to what's going on in government at all levels.
Oh, will that ever happen?
Yeah.
He said facetiously.
Yeah, 3 letters, IRS. All right, you want to talk about wolves, all right, descending on the people, and that's what Thomas Jefferson was talking about, and that's over 200 years ago. Those quotes. So this is why we're doing this skit. This is why we spent so much time putting this together, and it's why we're doing this radio program, to make sure people are aware that there is a better idea than this crazy income tax and the IRS and all the nonsense that goes along with it.
But just because it's a better idea doesn't necessarily mean you can just wave a magic wand and make it happen. It's going to take a lot of hard work by a lot of people, and this really has to come from the grassroots. And that's why we're here talking to people about the fair tax and what they can do to see it happen.
Yep. Well, let's see. What can we do? Well, first off, you go to www.fairtax.org. Join the 1040 Club if you're so disposed. All right. First, become a member. Sign up for the FAIRtax Friday, which is a electronic newsletter that comes every Friday, of course. That's why they call it FAIRtax Friday. And beyond that, if you are willing and able, you can become a paying member. You can start with as little as like $5 or $10 a year, or if you really want to support us, and we're really pushing this because we need this, the 1040 Club, in which you commit to donating $10.40 a month.
That's just a couple of Starbucks.
Yeah, that's
not hard to
it.
do at all.
Yeah, and I'm not that big of a coffee fan, so I'd gladly do it. The 1040 Club, if we get 3,000 people across the country, all right, then we have got it made. We will get this thing going. What else can we do?
Well, of course, you can always tell your friends and family about FAIRtax Power Radio here on SoundCloud and on YouTube. You can get it in either place. Of course, another thing you can do is really make your voice heard to your congressman. There is a tremendously good tool for that. It's called PopVox, Popvox, popvox.com. It lets you go online and express your opinion, pro or con, for or against, not just the fair tax, but any piece of legislation that is pending before Congress. You give it your zip code so it knows what district you're in and who to direct your comments to. And believe you me, we talked to Ted Yoho a while back on this thing, and he says everybody up there has got staff that pays attention to that kind of thing. So you will be heard if you go out to PopVox and tell their congressmen and your senators that you want the fair tax.
Yep, that's right. And I also want to mention that there is a free interactive fair tax webinar every month. It's the fourth Thursday of the month. Now, you have to register, so go to that FAIRtax Friday newsletter that you get every Friday, or just go on to the website, fairtax.org, and look up the webinar. You have to register because they have to log you in and so forth. But it's free.
It's free, yeah.
Yeah, free and interactive. And you can ask questions. Sometimes you can voice it in. Sometimes you can just type it in. I've been listening. I think they're in their 6th year of doing these webinars, and it's turning out very well. We had a great attendance this last month. So free FAIRtax webinar, and it's interactive.
Who conducts those?
Mark Maneri and Larry Walters. Mark is the technical guy. He makes the thing work. Larry is one of the most knowledgeable people about the fair tax I've ever talked to. Just almost any question that somebody has or Larry has about the fair tax, Mark has. Larry is right there. He's got the answer.
So in the course of this thing, if you've got a question, you just type it into your little box there, and they'll see it and they'll answer it right there.
And they will get it. Yep. So it works very nicely. So I strongly encourage people to sign up for that free interactive fair tax webinar.
FairtaxNation.com. Touch on that.
FairtaxNation.com is a bunch of volunteers across the nation. They're not affiliated with any particular group, and they're just more volunteers like us, and they're doing whatever they can. They promote interaction with Congress, which is very, very important. So FairtaxNation.com, go on to that website. You can glean more information. You can sign up for their notices because generally they'll get information out about new co-sponsors and so forth before even FairTax.org does sometimes.
Okay. Once again, let's give our thanks to Chip Morris and Mel Turner, who helped us with the radio skit here at Jefferson Skit. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, spread the word to your friends and family to join us here on FAIRtax Power Radio. It's free. You listen whenever you want to. We're on SoundCloud.com and also on YouTube.com.
Yep, and both of those websites have free apps for your smartphones.
Amen. Okay, and that's just about going to wrap up this edition of FAIRtax Power Radio. So until next time, I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Ron Bolero.
Reminding you the fair tax, once you understand it,
you'll demand it.